I'm going to have Scott Cormode come up. He is a dear sojourner in this work of cultural care. He's the director of innovation. Thank you so much, Scott, for leading us into this discussion.
I'm going to do something decidedly low-tech today. I have no PowerPoint. You have a handout, something you can write on, something you can... The whole point is that this is the start of a conversation that ideally you will take home with you and engage in. So I have a question to start with. How many of you plan to eat food today? How many of you slept under a roof last night? How many of you have ever had a job? That means that you have engaged the marketplace. And we spend a lot of our time talking about culture care. And so what we're going to do is spend about a half an hour together talking about culture care and the marketplace. But rather than just simply say, okay, any of you who are not in the business world can just be quiet now, what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to talk about how it relates to the marketplace. But then I'm going to loop it back and talk about how it also relates to the Christian church and also to artists. So that's kind of the overview of where we're going today. But I want to start by talking about the Bible. You mind if I talk about the Bible? Is that okay? I want to refer to a passage that I am absolutely certain you have heard if you've been here the last couple of days. I want to refer to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 starts by talking about God was in the world, reconciling the world to himself in Christ Jesus, and then has given to us the ministry of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors. We've talked a lot about this reconciliation piece, but today I want to focus a little bit on what does it mean to be an ambassador? An ambassador is somebody who is a citizen of one country, who leaves their country and goes to live in another country with the expressed purpose of creating goodwill between the two. An ambassador is never at home, and at the same time is always an emissary of home. We've talked a lot in the last few days about exile. Think of Daniel as an exile, but think of him also as an ambassador, someone who was sent by God to live among the Babylonians in order to reveal what God had for the Babylonians. That's what it means to be an ambassador. And so that biblical image will overshadow all that we are going to talk about in this next half an hour. I want to start by just simply telling you a simple story. Normally when people talk about business or such, the protagonist, the person that they're focused on is some kind of person who is a captain of industry, who owns a large company and has control over, that's not what we're going to do. My guess is that most of you who raised your hand who have had jobs have also had a boss and have been a boss. And you live somewhere in the middle. That's what we're going to talk about. I want to tell you the story of a guy named Michael Wynn. Michael was the manager of a Long's drugstore. Long's drugstore doesn't exist anymore. It was bought out. But when he and I set this up, he was the manager of a Long's drugstore in Camarillo. And it was a drugstore that was right next to a retirement community. And so the drugstore was filled with two kinds of people. His employees were mostly 19-year-olds for whom this was their very first job. And so he spent a lot of time trying to teach them to do things like show up for work, don't steal things, sweep the floor, stock the shelves, that kind of thing. He spent an awful lot of his time teaching. The other kind of person that showed up at this Long's drugstore where there were an awful lot of people from the retirement community for whom their daily activity was either to walk or often scooter over to the the drugstore, and that was their they would pick up something. They would pick up, sometimes it was pharmaceuticals, but mostly what it was is this was their outing. That would be the place that they would go. And so the store was filled with 19-year-olds and elderly people. And that's the world into which Michael was given his job. And we're going to spend some time talking about Michael, because Michael came to me and to his pastor, and he asked a question. Do I need to quit my job? The reason he asked, do I need to quit my job, is because he worked for a company that was not founded by Christians, that was not attempting to serve Jesus, and that sometimes did things that he thought were, well, not Christian. And so he came to us, to me and to his pastor, and said, should I quit my job and become a minister? Under the assumption that the only way to be pristine in the caring for your culture is to abandon your culture and to go and live in a pristine place. And so much of the conversation that we had, we're going to talk about today, because we're asking the question, how do we practice culture care in the midst of all the work and all the things and all the stuff that's happening in the marketplace? And I'm going to give you a phrase. I believe that this is what we are called to do. Whether we are in the marketplace, whether we're artists, every single Christian planted by Jesus Christ as an ambassador is called to do this. We are called to create shared stories of future hope that make spiritual sense of the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. That's what we're called to do. That's why if you look on the sheet that I gave you, it's in giant letters. Sometimes these things aren't that hard. And what I've done is I've asked a series of 4 questions. And the 4 questions are designed so that any person, any Christian, any organization, anyone can ask these questions and root themselves and figure out what is next for me. And the first question is, who are the people entrusted to your care? I believe that every Christian has a calling, a vocation, probably more than one. And it all starts with the one who does the calling. What is the very first call? The very first call is the call of God to come follow me. It's the call of Jesus. It's the call to discipleship. But it's not just a call from someone, from Jesus. It is a call to someone. Every single one of us is given a people entrusted to our care. It's easy for us to think of tasks that we are supposed to do if we are good Christians. Those tasks are meaningless if we forget the people for whom those tasks are important. So let's think about our friend Michael here. Who are the people entrusted to his care? People entrusted to his care are 19-year-olds who are trying to learn things like how to show up on time, and a number of elderly residents who regularly come into his store. Now, his company has also entrusted him with things like making money and the like. But here's what Michael has said all along in every conversation I'd ever had with him. If I do my job caring for my employees, and if I do my job caring for my customers, then the whole business thing will take care of itself. And his regional manager would tell you that that is exactly the right thing. As a matter of fact, his regional manager, the time I interviewed him, we were working on this, he was 30, 31 years old. He was regularly being sent by his regional manager to either train or retrain managers in other stores and other places throughout Southern California, because those 2 things that he said, care for my customers, care for my people, did not come naturally to these other managers. So here, who are the people entrusted to his care? That was how he understood his notion of vocation and calling. And sure enough, it is the way that, say, Martin Luther understood the notion of vocation. Martin Luther would talk about how God gives each of us a people to whom we are called. And he said he could reduce the entire, all of Christianity into 4 words: love God, love neighbor. And where is the venue where you love your neighbor? It's wherever God plants you on a Tuesday morning or a Thursday afternoon. That's what culture care looks like. It's wherever you are planted to see that there are people entrusted to your care and to ask how to serve them. What we're going to do now is I want to show you a short video. And we're going to use that video as we interpret the rest of what we're going to say. I want to tell you about the video. The video is from Pixar. You've all heard of Pixar. They've won all sorts of awards. This is a short that won their very first Oscar. It goes back to 1988. You're going to see that pieces of it are incredibly crude. This was the first time that a human form was ever tried to be shown on a computer animated screen. And you're going to see that at times it's kind of crude. But we're going to use it as a way of understanding how do you make spiritual sense, or excuse me, how do you create shared stories of future hope that make spiritual sense of the people entrusted to our care. So who was the person entrusted to the 10 toys' care? Obviously the baby. What is the key moment in this entire video? The key moment happens after the 10 toy sees the baby, after the 10 toy is terrified of the baby, after the 10 toy runs away and is underneath the sofa and sees all the other toys cowering in fear. And then the baby falls, and the baby cries, and the 10 toy recognizes, I was created for such a moment as this. But it terrifies him. He could stay under the sofa just like every other toy, or he could go out and care for the person that had been entrusted to his care. But he knew it came at a risk. And it wasn't an idle risk. He went out there, and what happened? The baby picked him up and shaked him, and he was dented in the end. And what did he get as a result? The baby moved on. He didn't get any celebration. He didn't get anything other than this. He absolutely knew he had done what he had been created to do. And it was all because he saw himself in terms of the baby that had been entrusted to his care. So the first question we ask is, who are the people entrusted to your care? But then the second question we ask is, what are their longings and losses? What are the longings and losses that make up the human condition? I'm talking to a bunch of artists about the human condition. You all know, if this was 75 years ago and we wanted to talk about the human condition, I would show you instead of Pixar, I would show you a video of Laurence Olivier doing Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. Because that is where Shakespeare is contemplating this question. Are the losses and difficulties of life so hard that it would be easier if I just stopped living? To be or not to be, to die or to live or to die. And he goes on and he talks throughout that speech about the thousands natural shocks that flesh is heir to. And he lists them, all these difficulties. And then in the end, he says, well, I'm just too chicken. And so I guess I'll go on living. Who are the people entrusted to your care, and what are their longings and losses? What are the longings and losses of the people entrusted to Michael's care? What about those 19-year-olds? Well, a lot of them aspire to someday not work at Long's drugstore. Some of them are going to school. Some of them have dreams that they have in life. Some of them just aspire to no longer be living in their parents' roof. But they had all sorts of longings, and they have all sorts of losses. If you were to talk to Michael about what it meant to manage those 19-year-olds, he said, I do two things. I teach them, and I listen to them in their pain. Because I don't know if you remember what it was like to be 19, but there's an awful lot of pain involved in being 19. And a significant part of his job was simply to, listen to them long enough that they could take whatever their next step needed to be. And what about the residents, the elderly residents that came over? What did they have longings and losses in their lives? Absolutely. Questions about what am I going to be now that I'm no longer working? And what about my families that live far away? Or a lot of them are contemplating things like, is this all there is? He had lots of these kinds of questions that would regularly come up in just the daily life of being a manager of a Long's drugstore. The reason most of us don't think of that as part of the job of a manager of a Long's drugstore is that we systematically ignore those questions, and instead we pay attention to more important questions like, would you like paper or plastic with that? We are trained not to pay attention, and so we no longer see the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. But every single one of us, no matter where we are called, what we do, we encounter human beings, and those human beings have longings and losses. So what is our appropriate response to that? Well, if we are Christians, our job is to point to Jesus. Do I need to convince you of that? That our job is to point to Jesus. The scriptures are filled over and over again with people who help the people entrusted to their care see things from God's perspective. That's what they are called to do. So what was it be with these 19-year-olds or these people who are the residents who are wondering, is this all there is? Michael didn't have to be some grand evangelist who would stand on the counter and say, today I'm going to preach the gospel. All he had to do was actively pay attention to the longings and losses of people. And guess what happened? Those people came to him and said, help me understand. But even if they never did, Michael needed to understand those 19-year-olds' jobs in terms of what God calls us to. So, was sweeping the floor about sweeping the floor, or was it about practicing hospitality? One of the things that he had to teach his people was how to be generous, not give away money, but generous, kind to people who were older and grumpy. Because what happened is a lot of the time that the people that he encountered, that the older residents were in pain, were in physical pain. And have you ever noticed how pain makes people self-centered? And he had to tell his people, you don't get to complain about that. When people come into our midst, our job is to care for them on their terms. And part of what it meant to grow up and be more than 19 is to recognize it's not about you. Now, I'm guessing that some of you have heard this term vocation before. The idea of calling. And over again, when we Christians talk about calling, we make a deal on behalf of God that God doesn't make. We say the deal is that you will get to do what you are created to do. And what we accidentally tell people is you will never have to do something you don't want to do. Every calling that is worth it encounters human beings. And I don't know how to break this to you, but sometimes human beings can be a pain. Sometimes dealing with other human beings can be difficult. And that's part of the job. That's just part of what it means to have a people entrusted to your care. Now, if this was a paternalistic understanding of people entrusted to your care, you could simply beat down the people entrusted to your care and say, no, you need to be who I want you to be. But that's not what God calls us to. God calls us to a servanthood that says, I exist on behalf of them. It's not about me. So the fourth question that we ask is, how do we create shared stories of future hope? Now, at a conference like this, do I have to convince you about the power of storytelling? Please say no. You understand that if I can invite somebody into a story, I can take them so much further than if I wag my finger at them. You invite people into a story. How do you invite them into a story? Well, you take your story and my story and weave it together with a biblical story to create a shared story of future hope. So you listen to the 19-year-olds and you weave it in together with Michael's story and you create, through the scripture, a shared story of future hope. So let's go back to our friend Michael, who says, do I have to quit my job? When he asked that question, I did not answer him and say, yes, you must, or no, you must not. What did I do? I invited him into a story. Now, if we were second graders, we would know that there are only three things that are necessary for there to be a story. Second graders in the state of California are taught that you have to have three things to have a story: a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's it. Think about the whole phrase ambassador. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Once you lived here, then God called you and sent you to now live here on behalf of God. That's what I said to Michael, is I just simply said, look at this passage in 2 Corinthians. What does it mean to be an ambassador? An ambassador is someone who lives on someone else's turf with the express purpose of inviting others to see things from God's perspective. You are an ambassador to Long's Drugstore. Now, if your time as an ambassador is up and you are being recalled home, that could possibly happen, and God could assign you to something else. But don't ever think that because you go and live on foreign turf, that God has abandoned you or that you have somehow sullied the gospel. That is exactly what Daniel was sent to do, was to go live among a people who were not God's own and to proclaim to them the message of the gospel. So what does this have to do with Christian churches? My guess is that most of the time, what we do as churches is make a huge mistake when we go to the world. We say, world, community, neighborhood, what we'd like you to do is come to us and be like us. Whatever the opposite of an ambassador is, that is how we see ourselves as the church. We don't go to them on their terms and help them see and figure out what are the longings and losses of those people. What we do is we ask them to come and be like us, which is the exact opposite. And what is the role for artists? I believe that storytellers are the engineers of Christian innovation. If whatever we're going to do in the future, whatever we're going to invent, whatever it is that Christianity will become, it will become so because of the storytellers. And where will we find the storytellers? So I'm going to, with the last little tiny bit I have, I want to issue a challenge to any storytellers in the room. I want to give you an example. What is the appropriate biblical response to loss? The appropriate biblical response to loss is lament. The Psalms of Lament, well over half the Psalms, the way you find a Psalm of Lament is you take your Bible and you open it and you stick your finger in it. If you open your Bible and you stick your finger, you're probably in a psalm. If you stick your finger in a psalm, you're probably in a psalm of lament. The psalms of lament are the ones they don't actually tell in church. They're the ones where they say, God, I'm angry at you. And here's the message of the psalms of lament. God can handle your honesty, even and especially when you are angry at God. Because the psalms of lament are required to only have two things in them: exact honesty and a statement of trust. God, I'm angry at you, and I still trust you. So if you're going to go out to people entrusted to your care, and you're going to listen to longings and losses, one of the things that I'm going to challenge you artists in the room, those of you who write laments that don't just capture people's pain, but that are message of hope. That's what the Psalms of Lament are. They are, God, I'm in a terrible place and I trust you. So listen to the people entrusted to your care. What would a lament for a 19-year-old look like? What would lament for a store manager look like? What would a lament look like for an elderly community that is facing death? What is your job? To create shared stories of future hope that make spiritual sense of the longings and losses of the people entrusted to our care. Thanks a lot.